A young boy named Harold is the lead character in a children's book in which he has a crayon that can bring whatever he draws to life. Harold always embarks on many adventures with his crayon, but he also gets into trouble sometimes. In such situations, Harold thinks fast and gets himself out of whatever trouble he has brought upon himself. As he gets lonely, Harold draws a moose and a porcupine to be his best friends in his world. Years later, Harold grows older, but he still continues his adventures with his crayon. One day, after fixing Moose's antlers, he gets curious and wonders who drew him, because every other thing in his world was drawn by him. Suddenly, Harold hears the book narrator saying he's the one who drew him. Harold is surprised to hear this, and he asks what the narrator looks like. He says he once used to be like Harold, but that he's now an old man. He adds that in some way he's more like Harold's old man. Harold then asks why he can't see his old man, and the narrator mentions that it's because he's in a different place called the real world. Harold sounds surprised and asks what it is, and the narrator says that the real world is just like Harold's world, but with more color. As he says it's also a bit more complicated, Harold asks if he can visit his old man one day. The narrator says he wishes it was possible, and Harold mentions that anything is possible with the crayon. The narrator just says goodnight to him, and even though Harold says he has one more question, he's told to go to bed. The next morning, as Harold wakes up, he says he has a lot of follow-up questions for his old man, but he doesn't get any response. As he looks around and calls on the old man, Harold still doesn't get any response, and he looks worried. Porcupine says he's likely busy in the real world, and this gives Harold an idea. As he mentions that they need to go to the real world to look for his old man, he draws a door and writes the real world on it. Porcupine says she doesn't think it will work like that, but as Harold opens the door, he sees that it actually leads to a more colorful world. Porcupine looks excited to go into the real world, but Moose holds her back and says they need to be careful because the old man said his world is complicated. Harold then tells his friends to stay back to see if his old man will return. Moose thinks it's a good idea, and as Harold goes through the door alone, he lands in a park surrounded by people. He looks amazed by this and also starts walking around the park. He eventually runs alongside someone in the park, but as he gets insulted for wearing a onesie, he enters a nearby tent and takes one of the clothes there. Elsewhere, Porcupine tells Moose to move closer to the door to see how the real world looks. As he does this, Porcupine pokes him with a stick, and he rushes through the door, which then closes. Porcupine is disappointed by this, and even though she tries her best, she's unable to unlock the door. Meanwhile, Moose lands in the real world as a human, and he realizes that he now has hands and legs. As he checks how he looks in a mirror, he freaks out and screams, and some people in the park just stare at him. Shortly after, Harold sees an old man sitting on a bench in the park, and as he runs toward him, Moose sees him. They look happy to be reunited again, and Harold also seems excited to see that Moose is now human. As Moose says he didn't expect the real world to be real, Harold mentions that things are about to get better for them because he has just seen the old man. Following this, Harold runs to meet the man, but he gets hit with a walking stick. As Harold wonders why he did that, Moose says he's likely not the one they're looking for. Harold says sorry for this, and as they wonder how they'll find their old man in a world with many old people, he draws a bicycle with his crayon and brings it to life. The old man sitting in the park sees this and looks shocked, but Harold and Moose don't seem to care. As they leave the park with the bicycle, Porcupine finally opens the door and enters the real world as a lady. She looks quite excited to be in the real world, and she also admires her hands and legs. Meanwhile, Harold rides the bicycle on the road, but he seems quite reckless and eventually gets hit by a car owned by a woman named Terry, who quickly checks if her son, Mel, didn't get hurt. As Harold and Moose groan in pain on the ground, Terry goes to meet them to ask if they're fine. Harold complains about the cut on his finger, and Terry says she'll get him a band-aid from her purse. Before she does this, she notices that her car now has a flat tire. Terry looks disappointed because she doesn't have a spare, but as she calls someone on the phone, Harold draws a tire with his crayon, and Mel is shocked by this. When Terry looks back, she sees that Harold has already gotten her a tire, and she looks surprised. After she fixes it, she thanks Harold and Moose and apologizes for hitting them earlier. Harold sees Mel with a whistle, and as he asks what it's for, he says it's for his pet, Carl. Harold asks where Carl is, and Mel Mel mentions that he's right there. It then turns out that Mel's pet is imaginative, and even though Harold realizes this, he pretends as if Carl is real. As he also asks what kind of pet Carl is, Mel mentions that he's part lion, eagle, and alligator. Terry seems to be tired of hearing her son talk about his imaginative pet, and she interrupts him to ask if she can at least take Harold and Moose to wherever they're headed. Harold and Moose accept the offer, and while they're in the car, Terry asks where they're going. Harold says they want to find their old man, and Mel asks if he's talking about his dad. Harold says it's likely the same thing, but as Terry asks where she can drop them off, Moose says he thought she would know that. Terry doesn't understand this, but she says she can still drop them off at a bus station or wherever they'll be staying for the night. Harold says they don't have anywhere to stay, and that Terry and Mel are the only ones they know in the real world. Mel tells his mom that they can stay with them, but Terry says they don't have an extra room. Mel thinks they can stay in the garage, but Terry insists that they don't even know Harold and Moose. Mel says his late dad always told them to help people in need, and Terry finally agrees to accommodate them for just one night. Mel looks happy about this, and Harold and Moose also thank her for this. Shortly after, they reach the house, and Terry says it's not really awesome because it could use a new coat of paint, a new roof, and some other things. Harold says it's great, but Terry doesn't say anything, and they all head inside. She then shows them where they'll be staying, and she also gives them new clothes. Harold is excited to be in the house, and as he sees a music book in a box, he asks if Terry is a musician. She says it was something she tried in the past, and that it's one of the dreams she had growing up. She then mentions that she now stocks shelves at a supermarket named Ollie's. Harold and Moose don't know what this is, and Terry says that Ollie's is a place that sells everything you could possibly want. Harold and Moose think it's a really cool job, but Terry says she actually hates her job. She then asks what they do, and while Harold says he's an artist, Moose mentions that he just follows his friend around. Following this, Terry leaves them alone, and Harold tells Moose that they are really lucky to have gotten such a nice place to stay. Moose doesn't think they belong in the real world, but Harold says they'll return home after they find the old man. Elsewhere, Porcupine sees the old man in the park and runs to meet him, but he quickly uses his walking stick to push her back. He also tells Porcupine to leave him alone because he doesn't want any problems. After she leaves, the old man calls the cops to report what happened, and as two detectives, Love and Silva, get to the scene, he tells them about Porcupine and the other men he saw earlier. The man's statement is taken, but as the detectives walk away, Love mentions that the old man is likely being delusional because there's no way someone would draw a real bicycle with a crayon. Later that night, while Harold is watching the sky, Mel sees him through the window and calls him into the living room. As he gets there, Mel shows Harold some of his drawings, and he admires them. Mel says the last one is a drawing of Carl, and even though there's nothing on the paper, Harold pretends to admire it. Mel then explains that he wanted to get a dog a while ago, but he eventually settled for Carl because he's allergic to dogs. He adds that his parents used to play with Carl until his dad died. Mel mentions that Terry has been unhappy since then, and that he just hopes she'll be happy again one day. Harold says he can help with that, and Mel says he can also help with finding Harold's dad. After this, Mel asks how Harold drew the tire earlier, and he brings out the crayon. Harold then draws a butterfly and gives Mel the crayon to also try to draw something. Mel draws a spider fly, but as the insect seems to be aggressive, they both run out of the living room. Elsewhere, Porcupine keeps looking for Harold and Moose, and she eventually comes across a purple house. As she enters, she steals a jacket and also eats the cake in the kitchen. Suddenly, she hears someone in the house shouting that he has already called the police on her. Porcupine immediately runs outside, but as she escapes, the security camera captures her face. The next day, Terry is woken up by the spider fly in her room, and as she wonders what's going on, she goes downstairs and sees a lot of pies on the table. Terry then goes outside and sees Mel sitting with Harold and Moose while eating some pies. As she asks about the pies in the kitchen, Mel says that Harold made them. Terry looks surprised, and when she turns, she sees that her house has also been painted purple. Harold then mentions that he painted the house because she complained about it the previous day. As Terry looks confused, Mel tells her that Harold can do magic. Harold also shows Terry the crayon and says he can do anything he wants with it. Terry thinks he's making things up, and she tells Harold to stop filling Mel's head with such ideas because she still doesn't understand how he keeps playing with Carl. Mel. Harold agrees to put the crayon away, and Terry tells Mel to go to school. After she walks away, Harold cuts a small part of the crayon for Mel, who looks shocked and thanks him for it. As they head in different directions after Terry leaves for work, Mel turns back to follow Harold and Moose. Harold asks if he's not supposed to be in school, but he says he'll take the longer route so he can still help with finding Harold's dad. Shortly after, Mel says they need a plan, but Harold doesn't think it should be too hard to find his old man. As he sees another old man, Harold runs toward him, but the man attacks him. Harold realizes that it won't be easy to find his old man, but he then sees a package on the ground about a library where he can find anything he wants to know. Harold suggests going there, but Mel says it's going to be a long walk. Harold then says they don't need to walk when he can draw skates for them. After he does this, they're able to get to the library faster, and they see the head librarian, Gary, reading his new book in a room with no guests. Mel knows who Gary is, and as he greets him, the librarian asks how he's doing. He also asks about Terry and Mel's imaginary pet. Mel says they're fine, and he introduces Harold and Moose to Gary. While Moose says he's going to wander around the library, Harold stays behind, and Gary sounds jealous that he spent the night at Terry's house because he actually likes her. Even though he doesn't make this known, Gary asks Harold what he wants, and he says he's there to look for his old man. Gary says they don't find missing persons in a library, but as he's about to walk away, Mel says he can't believe the librarian won't help them, despite how amazing Terry says he is. Gary sounds shocked to hear this, and he asks if Terry really said that about him. Mel says she did, and that she would be disappointed if he doesn't help them. Following this, Gary offers to help Harold find his dad, and he takes them to his office. He then asks what Harold knows about the old man, but he doesn't seem to know much. Gary says they won't be able to find the old man without concrete information, and Harold says they can simply make the man find them. Gary thinks it's a good idea, and he suggests flying a little plane in the air and writing a message in the sky for the old man. Harold likes this, and as he leaves the library, he starts drawing a plane. Meanwhile, Gary attends a virtual meeting with a publisher who says that her company won't be publishing his book. Gary asks why, and she says that most people can't even say the title, which includes the name of Gary's hero character, Gugaraw. Gary says it's not hard to pronounce, and that people just don't understand his world. The publisher doesn't seem to care, and as the call ends, Gary complains about how people don't just get him. As he looks outside his window, he sees Harold drawing a plane with a purple crayon, and he looks shocked. He then realizes that Harold is a character from a book titled Harold and the Purple Crayon. Moose doesn't like the idea of entering a plane because he's a land animal, but Harold and Mel convince him to come with them to write the message in the sky. Moose then joins them, and even though Harold initially struggles to fly the plane, he eventually gets it into the sky. Mel says they can leave a phone number in the message, and he suggests using his mom's number. Following this, Harold writes the message in the sky, and he eventually gets the others to jump out of the plane so that they can land with a parachute. After looking at the message in the sky, Mel leaves for his school, and Harold and Moose decide to walk around the city. As Mel gets to school, he tries to sneak into his classroom without anyone seeing him, but two bullies eventually stop him. They try to collect his whistle, but Mel defends himself and mistakenly hits one of them. One of the teachers hears this, and she tells them to go to the principal's office. Elsewhere, Harold and Moose get to Wally's and decide to go inside to check it out. Coincidentally, Terry is also there during her shift, and she starts getting calls from strangers saying they're the ones she's looking for. As she keeps answering her phone, her boss complains about this and warns her to stop taking calls during her shift if she doesn't want to get fired. Terry says sorry for this, and after a while, she sees Moose and Harold inside the store. She then asks what they're doing there, and if they have anything to do with the calls she has been getting. Harold doesn't say anything, but Terry tells them to leave because she's so close to losing her job. Harold says she should be happy because she hates the job, but as her boss passes, she says she loves it. Suddenly, Mel's school principal calls Terry to inform her that Mel has been involved in an incident at school and that she'll have to send him home for the day. Terry says she'll be there to pick him up, and as the call ends, she tells Harold and Moose that she could lose her job if she misses her shift. Harold and Moose offer to fill in for her, so she takes them to the stockroom and tells them to help her arrange the boxes based on their respective labels. Harold and Moose say they can do it, and Terry leaves. Just a few minutes later, Harold and Moose get tired of arranging the boxes, and they decide to help people in the store. store. Elsewhere, Terry picks up Mel from school and asks what went wrong. He says he didn't mean to hit the boy and that they were trying to take his whistle. Terry says he needs to forget about Carl, and Mel looks sad. As he says that Harold believes in Carl, Terry tells Mel that it might not be reasonable to listen to someone who does crayon magic. Meanwhile, Harold's idea of helping people involves using his crayon, and he ends up putting springs under someone's legs to make her taller. He also draws a puma for someone and puts a real blade on a toy helicopter, which a little girl uses to fly around the store. This scatters the whole place, and by the time Terry returns to the store, she sees that nearly everything inside has been destroyed. She also meets Harold and Moose to ask what happened, but she tells them not to mention anything about a crayon because she doesn't even think it's real. Suddenly, Terry's boss comes over to talk about what happened, and as he sees Harold and Moose, he asks who they are. Harold says they're Terry's friends who helped fill in for her when she went to pick up Mel from school. Terry's boss can't believe this, and he fires her. As she leaves, Harold and Moose say sorry for what they did, and they also ask if there's anything they can do to help. Terry says they've done enough already, but as she walks away, Mel tells her not to be angry at Harold and Moose because they were only trying to help in their own way. He also mentions that since she never liked the job, she can now find something that will make her happy. Terry thinks about this and then allows Harold and Moose to follow her. Later that night, while they're walking near a park, Terry talks about how she always wanted to be a concert pianist, and Harold says it's not too late for her to fulfill her dream. Terry thinks she's already over it, but as Harold gets Moose and Mel to distract her, he draws a piano and tells her to play. Terry looks shocked to see the piano, but she says it has been too long since she last played. Mel also encourages Terry to play the piano, and she finally agrees. As she plays it, people quickly gather around her to watch her performance. After she's done playing, everyone applauds her, and Gary also arrives at the scene. He then commends Terry's performance and tells Harold that he thinks he has found the old man. Harold asks where he is, but Gary mentions that there's a lot of explanation involved, so they'll have to come with him. Mel wonders why Gary is suddenly trying to help, but he says he's just a nice person. Mel thinks he's up to something, but as he suggests following them, Terry tells him to stay with her, and Gary supports this. Meanwhile, Silva looks at the picture of Harold and Moose and asks Love if they look like criminals, because they're the ones who reportedly trashed Ollies. Love thinks they look strange, and as they enter their car, Porcupine coincidentally walks past them and goes into a restaurant. As she runs out of the place after trashing it when she's insulted by the waiter, Silva sees her and runs after her. Elsewhere, Gary shows Harold and Moose the book they came from, and as they take a look at it, they realize that the author is their old man. Shortly after, Porcupine runs into the park where they're sitting, and she sees Harold and Moose. The three of them look happy to see each other again, but Silva suddenly shows up and arrests Porcupine. As Harold and Moose say they're her friends, she also arrests them. While they're in a holding cell, Harold says he'll get them out if he's able to retrieve his crayon, which has been seized by the cops. He then sends Moose to sneak out to get the crayon, and as he does so, Harold draws a few things that help them escape. The next morning, the bullies at Mel's school lock him inside a storeroom, but as he remembers that he has a part of Harold's crayon with him, he draws Carl. With this, Carl breaks the door, but he also trashes the school. After a teacher sees him, Mel runs out of the school and sees Harold and Moose waiting for him. They also introduce him to Porcupine, after which they mention that they've already discovered that their old man is an author named Johnson. Mel quickly finds where he lives, and they all head over there on a bike. As they get there, Harold knocks on the door and asks for Johnson, but the lady inside the house tells him that the author is dead, and the house is now a museum. Harold is shocked by this, and as he sits down to think, Terry arrives at the house and asks Mel what happened at his school. He says it was Carl who trashed the place, but Terry doesn't believe him. She then tells Harold that he needs to stay away from her son because he's filling his head with imaginative things. Harold feels sad to hear this, and Terry leaves with her son. Almost immediately, Harold's bike disappears, and as Moose and Porcupine ask what they'll do next, Harold says it's all over for them because the old man is dead. Moose says he can still do something, but Harold doesn't think so because it was the old man who created their world and the crayon. Suddenly, Moose and Porcupine disappear, and Harold is shocked by this. Elsewhere, Terry's car tire also disappears, and it nearly causes an accident. As Harold is walking helplessly on the road, road. Gary shows up and offers him a ride in his car. Shortly after, while Terry's tire is getting fixed, Mel sees Gary driving Harold home. He looks shocked by this and tells his mom that he thinks Harold is in danger, but Terry says she doesn't want to hear the name anymore. After Gary gets to his office, he convinces Harold that the crayon's powers are too strong for only him and that he needs to give it up. As Harold gives it to him, Gary traps him to a wall and tells him that he'll use the crayon to create his own world and get his revenge on the people who rejected him. Later that night, Mel sneaks out of the house to help Harold, but as he gets to the library, Gary also cuffs him to the wall. He then says he knows Terry will be sad about losing her son, but that he'll comfort her. Mel says he's a messed up person, and this gets Gary pissed, so he draws a hole in the ground in front of them before leaving. Shortly after, Harold says sorry to Mel for not being able to save him. As he says he really messed up, Mel mentions that he actually made things better because he believed in him, Terry, and Carl. He adds that Harold just needs to believe in himself. Harold is happy to hear this, and Mel also gives him the small crayon. With this, Harold draws a key to unlock their cuffs, and everything that disappeared earlier reappears. After Terry checks Mel's room to find him, she notices that he's not there, so she heads out. Before she leaves, she sees the purple color reappear on her house, and this leaves her shocked. Meanwhile, Harold and Mel find Gary in the park, and he asks how they got out. Harold shows him the crayon he used, but Gary says he has a bigger one. The two of them then draw different things to fight each other. As Gary eventually falls to the ground, Harold tries to get the crayon from him. Interestingly, Gary swallows it, and this gives him the crayon's powers. He also transforms into the hero from his book, and Terry arrives at the park. As Mel tells her what happened, Terry says they need to leave, and Harold supports this. Before they leave, though, Gary draws out his weapon and smashes it on the ground to break off some parts and fill it with hot lava. Mel and Terry nearly fall into it, and as Harold runs to help them, Gary strikes him with lightning. Harold loses his crayon in the process, and he's left disappointed by this. Terry then gives Mel his whistle and says she should have believed in him earlier. Following this, Mel uses the whistle to call on Carl, who immediately attacks Gary. Unfortunately, Gary captures Carl, and Mel can't believe this. Harold then tells him that he's using the crayon for the wrong things, but Gary doesn't seem to care. He also says that Harold is just a regular cartoon drawing, without a narrator or friend to help him. Harold then says he still believes in himself and his friends. As Gary says that friends are underrated, Moose and Porcupine show up to help Harold. Harold tells them that he has lost the small crayon, and Porcupine quickly helps him get it, even though Gary eventually strikes her with lightning. Harold still gets the crayon and draws a spider fly to retrieve the bigger crayon from inside Gary's body. As the creature does this, Harold gets the crayon back, and everything Gary destroyed returns to normal. Harold is happy about this, and the others also look relieved. As Gary sits alone, Harold asks if he's okay, and he says he just wanted his own world where he would blend in well. Harold feels sorry for him and draws a door for Gary to go through to enter his own world. After he does this, though, Carl burns down the door, and everyone looks shocked. The next day, Harold and the others go to Johnson's house to check out the place. As they look around, the lady working there gives Harold a letter Johnson wanted him to read to know why he was created. After a while, Harold reads the letter and realizes that Johnson created his character to inspire people that with a little imagination, they can make their lives whatever they want it to be. Following this, Harold draws a door to his cartoon world and says goodbye to Mel and Terry before returning home with Porcupine and Moose. On a quest to find the narrator of his book, Harold and his friends went to the real world for the first time. Even though things didn't eventually turn out as expected, Harold realized that, without his old man, all he needed to do was to believe in himself. With this, he was able to defeat Gary and also keep the real world safe. One lesson to learn from this story is that, while life may not always go as planned, determination and self-belief can help us overcome challenges and shape our destinies. Just like Johnson said, you can make your life whatever you want it to be with a little imagination.